From Atlanta, Georgia, welcome to Fearfully and Wonderfully Me, a podcast for women on leadership and life skills with Rhea Story. Rhea shares powerful life and leadership principles, helping you maximize your potential and become the woman God created you to be.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode on Women with Influence, Mother Teresa. I had the idea that I wanted to do a couple of episodes or a series of episodes on studying influential women, not necessarily women who are in positions of authority or leadership, but women with influence, women who had a lot of impact, a lot of influence, because I think that there are lessons to be learned that when we study women who had influence and impact, we can learn from them and study those lessons and then apply them to our own lives. And it's also incredibly inspirational when we look at the stories of other people who've been able to overcome incredible odds and gone on to do wonderful things. So I had the thought for this a couple of different topics for this episode, and then the first thought that came to mind was, well, who would I choose to be the first woman that we talk about on this episode? Because there's so many, and I've mentioned before, I love to read, especially biographies, because they're, again, lessons that we can learn from inspirational people and leaders throughout history. And so I have tons and tons of books on my bookshelf and even more in my Kindle. And so many of them, as I reflect back on the stories of people who inspired me, so many of them have great lessons that I'd love to share. And then I was like, well, how do I choose who would be the first one? And really the decision to choose to focus on Mother Teresa for the first episode of Women with Influence it was a natural fit, because I think I know Mother Teresa has been an incredible example of a woman who wasn't in a formal position of authority, and yet she's had incredible impact and influence all over the world, all over the world. So it's been some time ago that I actually read a book on Mother Teresa. It's her private writing. So it's not just an autobiography or a biography, but it's a collection of her writings and letters back to her as well. And they're staged chronologically within the book. So it's really good insight into not just a biography with the facts about her life, but really an opportunity to learn from her in her words as she talks about, God's presence in her life and the moment that she felt called to go into the slums of India. And so I really enjoyed this book, just because, again, it was something different. It wasn't just a biography, but it was incredible to be able to read her letters and her writings and learn from how she was thinking. So, you know, one of the things I learned from this book was she first felt called to go into the slums of India and minister there in September of 1946. And she didn't always talk about the details of that, but she writes about it in one of her letters, and she calls it Inspiration Day. She was on a train and she was going for an annual sabbatical where she was working as a teacher there in some of the schools, and she, took her annual sabbatical or annual vacation or period of rest retreat, and she talks about September 10th, 1946, and she says the moment that she felt just a call within her calling as a nun, she says it was a second calling. It was a vocation to give up even Laredo, where I was very happy, and a calling to go out in the streets and serve the poorest of the poor. And it was in that train I heard the call to give up all and follow him into the slums, to serve him in the poorest of the poor. And I knew it was his will, that I had to follow him. There was no doubt it was going to be his work. And she goes on to say this was really the founding day of the Missionaries of Charity and all of the work that they started first there in India, in Calcutta, but later Missionaries of Charity went all over the world. And, she goes on throughout that, the next couple of letters and writings to talk about the obstacles that she faced. You see, once she felt the calling, because she was a nun, she had to get formal permission from the leaders above her. And so she would write to them and ask for permission and just, permission to go out and minister there in the streets to the poor people there. And she would receive an answer no, or she wouldn't receive an answer at all. And it took her years to actually get approved to go out and fulfill her calling. Years. Now, for a nun, if you're not really familiar with the Catholic nuns, they take a vow of obedience. So for her, she had taken a vow of obedience to the leaders in the church, and she absolutely had to have their permission, from her perspective, to go out and fulfill her calling. Well, what's interesting is that, you read through her writings and she remains positive and upbeat, but she never stopped asking. I mean, it went on for years. She would write a letter to an archbishop, and she would write a letter to the next bishop who succeeded him, and it would go on for years. And she would just write back and forth, and they would say no, and she would ask again, and she would ask again, and always very respectfully and certainly with obedience. And but she never stopped. And I didn't know that. I didn't realize until I read her book that the obstacles she had to face just to get started with her ministry were incredible. I mean, how many of us ask or have an idea to do something and we get turned down or rejected? That happens to probably almost any of us. But how many times are we told no throughout our lives, and yet we persist for years? I know that I haven't always had that kind of determination in saying, I'm not going to take no for an answer. I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep asking. I'm going to find a way to fulfill God's calling on my life. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It shows a lot of character from her. Excuse me. It shows an incredible amount of her character and just her persistence. So what I wanted to share with you is one of her writings where she was asked to actually detail out what it was that she wanted to do. And she says, number one, we would love, and she's like, what exactly do I plan to do? I want to satisfy the desire of our Lord by leading a life for him and becoming Indian, as in the country India, and leading that life for him and the souls of the poor. To be united completely, we have to be poor. Here comes the poverty of the cross, absolute poverty. And to be able to see God in the poor, and to always be at his disposal. And by this, my sisters and myself will desire to bring Christ into the unhappy holes of the slums of the Calcutta poor, and later on of other places. And then the question was, well, how do you plan to go about it? And she said, well, by going among the people and nursing the sick in their homes, and helping the dying make their peace with God, and having free schools in the slums for the little children, and visiting the poor in the hospitals. In a word, act on the charity of Christ. Well, how would you form your disciples? Comes the next question. And she says, well, by giving them complete knowledge of the spiritual life, so that in the street or the holes of the poor, or at home in the convent, they would live a life close to God. And she goes on to say, what type of people, or the next question was, what type of people would you recruit for this work? And she goes on to say, well, girls from the age of 16 and up, and they must be strong in body and mind with plenty of common sense. I love that she includes that. She says there's no special qualifications except they must be of bright and cheerful disposition. Now, it's interesting that's one of the things she picked out, because she knew that people who have a positive, cheerful attitude and a positive, pleasant disposition are able to share that joy. And the one thing she wanted to do was share the joy of God. And sometimes she goes on later in the book to say, sometimes the nuns themselves would have to beg for food because they absolutely didn't have anything. And every time they did get something, they gave it away. And so sometimes the only thing that she could do was just be a shining light in the presence of the people she was around. And sometimes that's all she had to give them. So she knew that in choosing other women and girls to help her in this mission, they absolutely had to be cheerful. They absolutely had to be positive. They absolutely had to be that example of light. And I love that. So, Mother Teresa's story is incredible. She would go on to eventually get permission to form a formal charity there in Calcutta. And it continues to spread. The Missionaries of Charity just had a task to love and care for people. And it was eventually not just recognized by the church, but it went on to spread, and they built more branches and more branches. And in 1979, she actually received the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. And I mean, her work has been recognized and acclaimed throughout the world. And she's, an example certainly of an influential leader that most of us have heard about. And there again, she didn't have a position of formal authority. She didn't have a leadership title. She wasn't a CEO or a vice president. But she's an incredible example of someone who has been able to influence hundreds of thousands or millions of people around the world throughout her work. And she never had a formal position of authority. So think of the lessons of influence. Number one, she always was very positive, very uplifting. And I think that's something that I certainly can take away, is that even in the face of all the obstacles she felt, she felt called to start this ministry, and she got told no for years and years and years by so many different people, but she stayed positive throughout it all. And number two, she didn't quit. The resilience is incredible, and just saying, no, I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to figure out how I can do it. How I can do it. Instead of focusing on being told no and saying, well, I'll just find something else to do, she's like, nope, I'm not going to stop. And the extreme poverty that she went through, and I mean, she got sick herself so many times, and constantly having to beg for just her own food, and that for the nuns themselves. And then I'd love to share, and it's probably a quote you've heard, but she always would tell the other nuns and the other sisters that would join her, she said, you know what, don't worry about what we can't do. She said, let's just focus on the small things and do them with love. She goes on to say, don't look for big things. Just do small things with great love. The smaller the thing, the greater must be our love. Don't look for big things. Just do small things with great love. And I love that, because so much of the time we think that we have to do something grand or something big or majestic to make an impact in the lives of other people. But when we can do small things with great love, sometimes those little random acts of kindness, or those little things that we can do for someone else, just again, be a light in the life of someone else, sometimes is enough. Because when we can be that example of light, we are shining. I think we're a reflection. We're reflecting or shining God's light through us when we can just remember to do small things with great love, and we can make an incredible impact in the lives of those around us. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be grand. One of the questions that Mother Teresa asked was, well, what if you can't do much? You've taken a vow of complete poverty. And she says, you know what, if I can just make an impact in the life of someone, of one person, that would bring God joy. If I can just make an impact in one person, she says, I go on to quote one of her, it's a question on the possibilities of success, and she says, I don't know what the success will be, but if the missionaries of charity have brought joy to one unhappy home, or made one innocent child from the street keep pure for Jesus, or give one dying person peace with God, don't you think it will be a worthwhile for offering everything for just that one, because that would bring great joy to Jesus? And so much of the time we get focused on what we can't do, and the roadblocks and the obstacles. But if we can just do one thing and touch someone positively, that brings joy. That brings joy. So I love the examples from Mother Teresa, and we could go on and on and on. But I wanted to share with you some of the highlights and some of the lessons that we can glean from her life and her example. There are so many of them, and her work has touched so many people. But there again, not focusing on leading or having authority or resting on a position, but she just focused on being an influencer and a woman with influence right where she was. Until next time.
Start increasing your influence and maximizing your potential with Ria's audiobooks. Available at audible.com, amazon.com, and iBooks. Please visit riastory.com to learn about Ria's books, resources, speaking, and training programs. Thanks for listening.